Russia's surprise strike strategy was built on a simple assumption: keep launching enough cheap drones, often enough, and eventually, Ukraine's defenses would start running out of money, missiles, and margin for error. That is what made these attacks so dangerous. Not just the damage they caused, but the pressure they created over time. So when analysts started paying attention to Japan's growing role in Ukraine's counter-drone effort, the real question was never just why Tokyo was getting involved. The real question was whether Japan might be helping Ukraine attack the deeper logic behind Moscow's air campaign. Because if that happens, this is not just another foreign support package. It could begin to erode one of the Kremlin's most useful tools for imposing pressure from a distance. If you're interested in military strategy, global power shifts, and the technologies shaping modern warfare, subscribe to the channel and let me know your thoughts below. To understand why this matters, you have to start with what Russia's drone campaign was actually designed to do. These attacks were never only about destruction. They were about forcing Ukraine into a permanent defensive sprint. Shahid-type drones and various decoys gave Moscow a relatively cheap way to hit infrastructure, stretch response teams, and keep civilians under constant tension far from the front line. But the real advantage was economic. If Ukraine had to spend expensive interceptors every time a lower-cost drone came in, Russia stayed on the favorable side of the equation. That is the hidden logic behind this strategy. It is a form of cost imposition warfare. The attacker spends less to create a problem than the defender spends to solve it. And over time, that becomes more than a tactical challenge. It becomes a strategic burden. But this is where the equation begins to shift. Because that kind of pressure campaign only works as long as the defender cannot build a cheaper answer. That is why Japan's role stands out. The surprising part is not just that Japan supports Ukraine politically, it is the kind of support now entering the discussion. According to public reporting, Japan-linked cooperation has focused attention on counter-drone technology, industrial partnerships, and the financial foundations needed to scale lower-cost air defense concepts inside Ukraine. That matters more than many headlines suggest. Japan does not need to flood the battlefield with dramatic heavy weapons to be strategically important here. Its real value may lie in something less visible, but potentially more consequential. Precision manufacturing, industrial credibility, component quality, financing discipline, and the ability to support production at scale. In modern war, those things can matter as much as a weapon system itself. Reports suggest some of this cooperation centers on lower-cost interceptor concepts and broader defense industrial development. The exact scale of the long-term impact remains debated, but if Japan helps Ukraine move from improvisation to reliable production, then the conversation changes. It stops being about emergency adaptation and starts becoming about sustainability. And that matters because sustainability is where this war may increasingly be decided. The real breakthrough here is not one specific drone. It is the effort to attack the cost imbalance itself. One of the most dangerous weapons in this war is not a missile or even a drone. It is the price difference between attack and defense. Russia can afford to launch relatively cheap one-way drones and decoys at scale. Ukraine cannot afford to answer every low-cost threat with its most expensive defensive options forever. So the strategic importance of cheaper interception is obvious. If lower-cost interceptor drones, mobile air defense layers, and short-range systems can absorb more of the burden, then expensive assets like Patriot batteries can be preserved for the hardest targets: ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and more complex salvos. This does not make high-end air defense obsolete. It makes it sustainable. That is the key distinction. A layered system works best when each layer handles the threats it was actually built for. If Japan is helping Ukraine strengthen the lower end of that stack, then it is not just adding capability. It is helping protect Ukraine's most valuable defensive resources from attrition. If this changes how you see modern warfare, hit like. Because once a war becomes about cost curves, production can matter as much as firepower. And that leads directly to the industrial question, which may be even more important than the drone itself. In wartime, the better idea often loses if it cannot be produced fast enough, moved safely enough, or financed consistently enough. Ukraine's defense sector has shown extraordinary adaptability, but it still operates under missile threat, supply pressure, and constant uncertainty. Small firms can innovate quickly, but scaling that innovation is far harder. That means surviving not just the battlefield, but the economics of wartime production. Dispersed manufacturing, Hidden workshops, redundant supply lines, secure components, and access to capital all become part of the weapon system. This is where Japan's involvement could be particularly significant, not just because of design input, but because of industrial systems thinking. Reliability standards, process discipline, financing mechanisms, long-term production culture. Some reports have highlighted plans involving production in high-risk areas and other extraordinary wartime arrangements, but details on those claims remain limited and should be treated carefully. The bigger point is simpler. If Japan helps Ukraine industrialize counter-drone defense, really industrialize it, not just prototype it, then Moscow faces a different kind of problem. Not a one-time tactical surprise, but a steadily improving defensive base it cannot easily exhaust. That does not mean Putin's strike strategy becomes literally useless overnight. The reality is more complicated, and in some ways, more revealing. Russia can still adapt. It can alter routes, increase the number of decoys, modify drone variants, and combine low-cost attacks with missiles in an effort to overload defenses. Mixed salvos remain dangerous precisely because they force defenders to sort priorities under pressure. Infrastructure is still vulnerable. Air defense is still a competition of timing, coverage, and inventory. So the idea that one partnership suddenly neutralizes the threat would be too simplistic. But that is not the real story anyway. The real story is whether the return on Russia's strike campaign begins to decline. If cheaper interceptors and better layered defenses keep improving, then each drone wave may produce less strategic value than before. Fewer expensive missiles get wasted. More attacks are absorbed at lower cost. The psychological pressure weakens if the defender becomes more confident and more sustainable. In that sense, the threat does not disappear. Its efficiency does. And for Moscow, that may be the more serious problem. Comment below, is this a real turning point, or are expectations getting ahead of reality? Because if Russia's strike model becomes less efficient, the implications go beyond Ukraine. Japan is not looking at this war only through a European lens. Tokyo has its own reasons to care. In East Asia, the same broad military questions are becoming increasingly urgent. How do you defend critical infrastructure against swarms of cheaper systems? How do you build layered protection without exhausting your budget on every incoming threat? How do you maintain resilience if an adversary uses numbers, pressure, and repeated low-cost attacks to create strategic fatigue? Those questions are highly relevant to Japan's own security environment. The East China Sea, pressure around Taiwan, North Korean missile activity, and concerns about regional escalation all push Tokyo towards solutions that are scalable, affordable, and adaptable. Supporting Ukraine may therefore offer Japan more than diplomatic alignment. It offers a live laboratory for low-cost interception, wartime manufacturing resilience, and distributed defensive doctrine. In other words, this cooperation may be as much about Japan's future as Ukraine's present. And that is exactly why the story becomes geopolitical. Once a Pacific power starts investing in lessons from a European battlefield, the boundaries between regional conflicts begin to blur. That is also why this partnership matters beyond drones. It may be an early sign of a different model of alliance behavior. For decades, military partnerships were often imagined in familiar terms. One state supplies weapons, another uses them. But modern conflict is producing something more complex. One country generates battlefield adaptation under extreme pressure. Another contributes industrial capacity, financing, and manufacturing reliability. Together, they create a more resilient defense model than either could alone. That is bad news for Russia. Not because Japan's involvement instantly rewrites the war, but because it shows that Ukraine is evolving from aid recipient into battlefield innovator with exportable relevance. It is also a warning about the future of warfare. The decisive edge may belong less to whoever owns the most prestigious systems, and more to whoever can connect combat lessons with scalable production fastest. If democratic states learn how to mass-produce affordable counters to cheap attacks faster than revisionist states can refine those attacks, then the balance in future wars could shift in ways we are only beginning to understand. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into global military power, because what looks like a narrow drone story may actually be a preview of how wars will be fought and financed in the next decade. So no, Japan has not made Putin's surprise strikes literally useless. That headline is too simple. But something important may still be happening. Japan may be helping Ukraine target the deeper vulnerability behind Russia's air campaign, The assumption that repeated low-cost attacks can wear down Ukraine economically and psychologically faster than Ukraine can adapt. If this cooperation scales, that assumption weakens. Russia's drone pressure becomes more expensive in strategic terms and less effective over time. If it does not scale, then Moscow retains one of its most reliable tools for draining Ukrainian defenses and shaping the rhythm of the war from afar. That is why the next phase matters so much. Are we watching the early formation of a new wartime model, where one country brings battlefield lessons and another brings industrial muscle? Or is this still too limited to alter the larger trajectory of the conflict? The answer will matter not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the future of air defense, alliance politics, and low-cost warfare across multiple regions. If you want more deep analysis on military power and global strategy, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your perspective in the comments.